In the 3rd century AD, a Persian prophet wrote a list of the 4 greatest kingdoms on earth. He named Rome. He named Persia. He named China. And the fourth was an African empire that most people alive today have never heard of. An empire that minted its own gold coins. Built towering obelisks that still stand today. Controlled the most important trade route in the ancient world. And ended the Kingdom of Kush. This is Aksum. And I genuinely believe it is the most underrated civilization in all of human history. The Kingdom of Aksum rose in the northern highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, a region of dramatic landscapes, fertile plateaus and strategic positioning that I believe was the single most important geographic advantage any ancient empire ever had. Aksum controlled the Red Sea trade routes at their most critical point. Every ship moving between the Mediterranean world and India, carrying silk, spices, ivory, gold and precious stones, had to pass through waters the Aksumites controlled. In my opinion, this made Aksum not just a regional power but a global economic force at a time when most of the world had no idea it existed. By the 1st century AD, Aksum was already a sophisticated urban civilization with its own writing system called Guizi, which is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity today. They had organized agriculture, a complex social hierarchy, monumental architecture, and trade connections stretching from the Roman Empire to India and deep into sub-Saharan Africa. At its absolute peak between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD, the Kingdom of Aksum was extraordinary by any standard of measurement you choose to apply. They minted their own coins, gold, silver, and bronze, making them one of only a handful of ancient civilizations with a formal currency system. I spent a long time looking into this detail because I find it remarkable. Aksumite coins have been found as far away as India and the Byzantine Empire. That's not regional trade. That's global commerce. Their kings used a title that tells you everything about how they saw themselves, Negusa Negast. King of Kings. A title so powerful it was still being used by Ethiopian emperors into the 20th century. And then there are the obelisks, the stelae of Aksum. Massive granite monoliths carved from single pieces of stone and erected as monuments to Aksumite power and religious belief. The largest ever erected stood 33 meters tall, taller than a 10-story building, carved from a single piece of granite and transported from a quarry miles away without wheels or modern equipment. How they moved it remains one of the great unsolved engineering mysteries of the ancient world. What I find most fascinating about Aksum is that its power was built not primarily on military conquest, though they were formidable warriors, but on commercial intelligence. The Aksumites understood something that most ancient empires never grasped, that controlling trade routes is more sustainable than controlling territory. Their port city of Adulis on the Red Sea was one of the busiest commercial hubs in the ancient world. Roman merchants, Indian traders, Arab merchants and East African traders all converged at Adulis. The goods that passed through Aksumite hands included ivory, gold, obsidian, slaves, tortoise shells, rhinoceros horn, and exotic animals, including live elephants exported to Rome for use in the Colosseum. In my view, the Aksumite trade network was the ancient equivalent of controlling a major international airport. Everyone needed to pass through. And Aksum collected its toll on every transaction. The Roman Emperor Constantius II sent an ambassador to the Aksumite court with letters addressed to the king of Aksum as an equal, not as a subject, not as a client state, but as a peer. Rome, the empire that defined itself by its superiority over all other peoples, addressed an African king as an equal. That detail alone tells you everything about what Aksum actually was. Around 350 AD, the king of Aksum, Ezana, did something that ended one of the longest-running civilizations in ancient history. He marched his army into the Kingdom of Kush, the African empire that had conquered Egypt and defeated Rome, and destroyed it. The inscription Ezana left describing this campaign is one of the most remarkable documents in ancient African history. He describes crossing rivers, defeating armies and burning the Kushite capital of Meroe. The civilization that had lasted 1,400 years, that had built more pyramids than Egypt, ended at the hands of the Aksumite army. But here is what I find most interesting about Ezana's campaign. Shortly before or around the same time as his conquest of Kush, Ezana converted to Christianity. He became the first monarch in African history to adopt Christianity as a state religion. And he did it before the Roman Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of Rome. An African king adopted Christianity as a state religion before it became mandatory in the Roman Empire. That sequence of events is almost never discussed. The Christianization of Aksum under Ezana transformed the kingdom in ways that still shape the world today. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth, traces its direct lineage to Ezana's conversion in the 4th century AD. The Guizi script that Aksum developed became the liturgical language of Ethiopian Christianity and is still used in church services today, 1,600 years after Aksum's peak. Aksum also has a connection to Islam that most people don't know about. When the early Muslim community was being persecuted in Mecca, before the Hijra to Medina, the Prophet Muhammad sent his companions to seek refuge with the king of Aksum. The Aksumite king at the time, called the Negus or Ashama ibn Abjar in Islamic sources, received the Muslim refugees with justice and refused to hand them back to the Quraysh despite enormous pressure. The Prophet spoke of the Negus with deep respect. When the Negus died, the Prophet performed the funeral prayer for him, the first time in Islamic history that the funeral prayer was performed for someone who died in a distant land. The connection between Aksum and the earliest days of Islam is one of the most extraordinary interfaith moments in all of ancient history. Like every great civilization, Aksum eventually declined. And in my opinion, the story of how it fell is as fascinating as the story of how it rose. The rise of Islam in the 7th century AD fundamentally changed the Red Sea trade routes that were the source of Aksumite power. Arab Muslim merchants increasingly dominated the maritime trade that Aksum had controlled for centuries. The economic foundation that had made Aksum one of the 4 greatest empires on earth slowly shifted away from their control. Environmental factors compounded the problem. Centuries of intensive agriculture had degraded the soil around the Aksumite heartland. Deforestation reduced rainfall. Food production declined. The population that a thriving empire could sustain began to outstrip what a weakening agricultural system could feed. The capital was eventually moved south to escape these pressures. The great obelisks were left standing. The gold coins stopped being minted. The trade networks contracted. And the civilization that had stood equal to Rome quietly withdrew into the Ethiopian highlands, where its cultural legacy survived in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, in the Guizi script, and in a royal dynasty that claimed direct descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Aksum matters in 2026 because it is one of the clearest examples of how the story of human civilization has been told selectively. A Persian writer in the 3rd century AD knew that Aksum belonged on a list with Rome, Persia, and China. Medieval Arab geographers wrote about Aksum with reverence. Indian merchants knew its ports intimately. But somewhere between the ancient world and the modern one, Aksum was quietly removed from the conversation about great civilizations. Its obelisks were left to stand in a country that European colonizers tried and failed to conquer, Ethiopia being one of only 2 African nations never fully colonized. Its story was left to the Ethiopians themselves to preserve. In my opinion, Aksum deserves the same documentaries, the same school curriculum coverage, and the same cultural recognition as Rome and Greece. The only reason it doesn't have that yet is the same reason the Kingdom of Kush doesn't have it. The people who wrote history decided certain stories weren't worth telling. Here is what I want to know from you. A Persian writer listed Aksum alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the 4 greatest empires on earth, in the 3rd century AD. Why do you think that same empire doesn't appear in a single history textbook taught in schools today? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one and I genuinely want to know what you think. Follow Forgotten Dominions. Because the civilizations they removed from the history books are always the ones that challenge the story they wanted to tell.